Well, joining us via StreamYard is Reginald Kadzutu, who is the CEO of Amana Capital, to discuss Kenya's debt burden. Welcome, Reginald. I hope you can hear me now.
I can hear you, Tess.
Great. Thank you so much for making time and being patient. Let's dig in. Now, the debt ceiling has been raised, giving the government an enhanced headroom to borrow up to 10 trillion Kenya shillings. Is this kind of debt ceiling sustainable given the country's economic status presently?
Well, the debt ceiling is really neither here or there. The debt ceiling is literally a number. They can either make it a percentage, they can make it 10 trillion, 11 trillion, 12 trillion, but it doesn't really answer the problem that the country is in terms of high indebtedness and how we got there. And the ceiling really will not actually stop the exchequer from borrowing. So I think there is a lot of conversation on the debt ceiling, which it honestly speaking, it's neither a policy tool, neither is it an instrument that can actually check government from borrowing. But it's a good benchmark to put there to give Parliament some work to do.
So are you implying that the government can go beyond the stipulated debt ceiling with no consequences at the moment?
Yes, because by the time the government goes to borrow, they normally borrow what has been budgeted for. Yeah. So once the budget has been approved, Treasury does not have to go back to Parliament to borrow. So if Parliament approves, like in this case, this year's budget 2022 to 2023 June, has a deficit of 842 billion, that they have shown how they plan on borrowing it externally and internally, to cover that deficit, so to speak. So once the budget has been approved by Parliament, by Senate, taken to the President and signed into law, Treasury does not have to go back to Parliament to borrow. So they will still borrow because then they have permission to borrow. So the truth of the matter is that instead of looking at the debt ceiling, we should be more worried about the budget deficit, because that's where borrowing, that's what leads to borrowing. When we spend more than we collect in tax revenue or any other revenue that the government gets into place. So the cap or the ceiling that we should actually be looking at is the budget deficit and not the debt ceiling, because you cannot approve a budget deficit then come and deny a debt ceiling, because then how do you expect the deficit to be funded? Because in essence, a deficit is the revenues are not enough, so I have to borrow to cover the expenditure. So that's where the real crux of the matter actually is. Once they approve the deficit, they cannot deny the borrowing.
Then what would you say is the significance of Senate and Parliament passing this bill and increasing the ceiling? Why would they do that if it has no significance or impact?
It is just a legal hurdle, where if someone breaks the ceiling, if Treasury breaks the ceiling, Parliament can say you borrowed without authority,
Oh,
but they
yeah.
cannot say that because they approved the deficit and the borrowing plan. So it's literally just, I don't even know why it is there. They should just actually remove it. It is of no consequence to whether Treasury will borrow or not borrow.
So is your take on the budget deficit? Do you think that the government was overambitious in putting up such a budget?
It has been the trend since the Jubilee government came into power. On average, around we consume, we have a deficit between revenue and expenditure of around 38 to 40% every year since 2013. So it has been the trend, that every budget has that deficit that continues to grow. But what has made this deficit bigger is because of the borrowing that happened between 2013 and 2017, which never went to real productivity, and most of it was stolen. You've realized now the impact on revenue is that for every 100 shillings that we collect, 70 percent of it has to go to payment of debt. So if you look at the debt repayment this year, 2022-2023, it's around 1 trillion there, 1.1, 1.2 trillion. So if you look at the deficit is literally us going to repay debt. So in essence, I don't think there's anything much Treasury could have done, because our revenue is actually enough to cater for salaries and every other expenditure that we have, including the disbursement to counties. But because of the debt situation we are in, where we have to repay 1.2 trillion of debt annually, which accounts literally for the deficit. So I don't think Treasury had any option but to literally just budget a deficit. So the rain started beating us when we started having annually overspending our revenue by 38 to 40% since 2018 is now coming to bite us.
Well, the Jubilee government would boast of infrastructure in various developments at the national level and even at the county level that they will justify that the debts have actually improved Kenya. What's your take on that?
Okay, if we start with the first, let's start with 2013 to 2017. They borrowed around close to 3 trillion, 4 trillion in that period. And the major infrastructure project that we have in that first term, to be honest, is only the SGR, which you can put at 300, 600 billion if you want to be generous. The question then is what happened to the other 3.4 trillion? Shillings. Where can they account for it in terms of even the infrastructure that they're talking about? Number two, most of this infrastructure has been done at inflated costs, or what we call budgeted corruption. Look for a big project, inflate the cost. The cost of doing a kilometer of road in Kenya, I think, is the highest in the region. Compared to other regions. Not because there is any special thing about doing roads in Kenya, but is that because we budget corruption in the budget. So most projects are overinflated. For example, the latest expressway, when it started and when it finished, I think the cost had doubled to close to 80 something billion for that stretch of road alone. But the initial cost was close to 50%, 60% of what the final cost was. So that's where our problem comes in. Yes, you have borrowed for infrastructure, but the amount actually going to the infrastructure is a fraction of what has been borrowed. The rest actually is being stolen. And some of this infrastructure is actually not generating income or is not going into areas which is increasing productivity or efficiency, where you will see that income will increase commensurate to the investment that has been done, even if you give 3, 4, or 5 years space. So we have unproductive debt going to projects which, one, are funded in US dollars but generate Kenya shilling revenue. It's just a whole mess. So I don't think they have really an excuse. They just misused borrowed funds.
So what do you think the country or the government can do to be able to relieve Kenya of this debt burden instead of adding onto it?
Well, whichever government is going to come into power in August it's actually their first headache, because they will have no money to do anything and until they sort out the debt burden. One way is to go ask for forgiveness from the people that have lent to us. We could literally just ask for forgiveness. Can you write off this debt? We are sorry. We misused the money. We don't have the money to repay. Or if they refuse, try and lengthen the tenure. So if it's a 7-year, try to lengthen it to 14, 15. Try to get a reduction on the interest you are paying so that you reduce the component that you are paying annually. Therefore, you reduce the percentage of revenue that debt is consuming. Yeah, and the last and final option they have, which is the toughest one, is to just default and say, guys, we can't pay and we won't pay. We start on a clean slate. Many other countries have done that before. Argentina has done it several times. But those are the only options that we actually have in terms of fixing the current situation that we have. Going forward, then an eye has to be kept on the budget deficit. If it continues growing, then we will never get out of this debt cycle that we are in. But we need to start reaching a point where we at least have close to a balanced budget, or if it is a deficit, it's a deficit that is financed at a reasonable cost, at reasonable tenures, and the money is going into places where we can say, if we put money here, we are going to generate this amount of income, or in terms of taxes, or we're going to save this amount of whatever in terms of cost. But we can't just borrow and hide behind that infrastructure takes time to see the benefit. Yet the debt that has been borrowed does not commensurate with the period where the infrastructure will start giving return. So if your infrastructure is going to give return in 20 years and your debt is repaid in 5 years, then that is a serious mismatch. And that's something that the new government, whichever government that is going to come, has to seriously look at.
Okay, now since we are heading to general elections and government is definitely going to change in some way, what are some of the ways the government can generate money without borrowing?
Test the government is going to change, not in some way. It is going to change. We're going to have a new president, either way. But how do we generate? How does the government generate money? The government only has two options of generating money. It's either borrowing or taxation. But if they want to generate more taxes, is then grow the economy. Not just grow GDP numbers like what Jubilee have been doing, but grow people's incomes. Because when people have income, you grow, the quality of growth becomes good enough to generate additional revenue. Because, for example, if Safaricom continues to do very well, they pay more taxes. If Coca-Cola continues doing well, they pay more taxes. If more people get employed, you get more PAYE from the people. That is the best way the government can actually make any revenue. The other way is the government can literally just cut costs, unnecessary projects, not to try and implement their whole manifestos in 5 years. Some of the things that they want to do are things that cannot be done in 5 years. They have to be accepted nationally, and there are projects that continue for beyond 1 term, 2 terms, 3 terms, and the like. But that has been a serious problem that we've had in the country, where a president wants to achieve everything in 4 years, 5 years, because the new person who's going to come will come with their own bag of goodies. So if the new government can actually create a blueprint that the country can follow, no matter who is president, then you start seeing waste going away, projects started and not finished, but we end up having one direction going forward as a country. That's the only way we can manage this situation, generate revenue, save on costs, and slowly but surely start reducing our budget deficit to a very manageable level.
That makes sense. Last but not least, do you think the current high cost of living in the country is related to our debt situation? And what would you say the government needs to do to be able to bring down the high cost of living?
Well, the high cost of living, Chess, is a factor of many things. As much as people don't want to accept it, Kenya is an open economy, so we are affected by what happens globally. We import all our oil and our fuel. Note in 2021, around January, February, there, end of 2020, fuel was below $20 a barrel. Fuel now is above $100 a barrel. There's nothing the government can do in the short term. They should have done something when it was 20, but they couldn't do because we don't have enough storage capacity to store fuel other than the amount of fuel that we need for 1 month. So there's a lot of short-termism which has bedeviled the country. And if we can start getting more long-term planning, especially on things that affect us externally, so we import most of our wheat, unfortunately, from Russia and Ukraine. So global wheat prices have gone up. Most of the fertilizer in the world comes from Ukraine and Russia. So the price of fertilizer has gone up globally, and there's nothing the government can literally do about that. So to blame the current high cost of living on debt alone will be stretching it. It has played a role because then it has reduced the fiscal headroom the government could have had maybe to try and cushion Kenyans from the high cost of living, but they would not have been in a place to be able to prevent the high cost of living, not because of a failure of their own now, but because of systematic failures starting from independence to now, where we have not been able, one, to secure ourselves to be food secure, energy efficient, and be able to survive. Like for now, we are facing a drought. We've been facing droughts since Independence Day, and no one has taken effort to actually try and increase the acreage under irrigation. So again, that has nothing to do with debt. It's just literally poor leadership, poor planning, and one day the chickens have to come to roost. And this year they are really coming to roost in a
Sports,
hard
Ian.
way.